The death penalty has been around for centuries, and it has always been a gruesome and inhumane practice. From burnings to hanging to more modern electrocution and lethal injections, Americans have been convinced that killing the killers is an effective treatment to prevent more killing. Not only is capital punishment ethically wrong to some, but it has proven to be ineffective in more ways than one.
So the red states show the states that have the death penalty, and the blue states show the ones that don't. And so this shows that the overall majority of America has the death penalty. So the basic cost to not have the death penalty is based off the cost because it's millions of dollars from American citizens' tax money that goes to pay for each prisoner's death. And it's also cheaper to have a prisoner for life, and it doesn't lower crime rates like many people think that it shows an example like not to do that, but it really doesn't. And um, people don't think that people don't think of the death penalty before committing an actual crime, and violence rates are higher because the government is allowed to kill people, and it causes people to revolt on that idea. And then racism, it shows that almost like a majority of black people are on death row, whether they're not innocent or not. It's based off of like racial convictions.
Leader of the Georgia Republican Party, Attorney David J. Burge, once said, "Capital punishment runs counter to core conservative principles of life, fiscal responsibility, and limited government. The reality is that capital punishment is nothing more than an expensive, wasteful, and risky government program." This argument against capital punishment is a strongly supported one, especially with the price of the death penalty so expensive compared to more humane alternatives such as life in prison, the risks of execution methods gone awry so probable, and the amount of human lives being tarnished so high. The death penalty is superficially humane because killing a human can never be viewed as humane, regardless of the supposed painless route of death. Injections may not work, electrocutions may not be strong enough, the list of possible errors is endless. These executions are not as seamless as they appear in movies and TV shows, leaving some victims of capital punishment in the process of being executed for lengthy periods of time, 40 minutes, even up to a grueling 2 hours. Under these circumstances, these quick and humane executions turn into harsh punishments and torture, going against the Eighth Amendment. Most inmates spend years on death row, and waiting for their impending death is obviously mentally taxing. In California, in the last 10 years, there have been 750 inmates on death row, but only 3 of them have been executed in those 10 years, violating the Eighth Amendment because living in constant fear of being executed by the government is not healthy and a twisted punishment and form of torture. Additionally, some pharmacies refuse to provide injections due to the ethical dilemmas that capital punishment raises. And the worst case, injections may not be effective, like the more recent instances of them expiring. With lethal injections difficult to come by, execution by injection, the modern way of capital punishment, is too much of a hassle to continue in the future. One of the most troubling arguments against the death penalty is that no one can be 100% positive that the accused is not guilty and is in fact innocent. Here are some more popular arguments against the death penalty. The death sentence costs 6 times more than a life sentence, and the trials that lead to capital punishment is often 8 times as much money. It does not make sense for so much tax money from our citizens to go toward what many of them do not believe in, and much less of it could go toward a more humane route of punishment, still keeping them safe from criminals on the street. This next argument is logical. Killing killers won't bring back victims. No matter how many people we kill, the victims of these crimes will not come back to life. So why kill more people in the process of seeking vengeance? The death penalty was initially integral to the U.S. punishment system because jailing used to not be as effective. Currently, with modern technology and superior security, it is now possible for inmates to be kept under the government's watch in prison safely and successfully. We as citizens no longer have to live in fear of the harshest criminals escaping and don't have to kill people out of this fear anymore either. Last year, there were 14,000 murders and only 35 executions. This shows that capital punishment is not affecting the amount of murders a year, or in other words, murderers are not scared off by the death penalty, like some people argue. Capital punishment should not be one last resort for the family of the victims to get vengeance. There are many laws in place that prevent the abuse of laws as ways for people to pursue their ideal ways of vengeance, and capital punishment should not be one of these ways.
The death penalty breaches the Eighth Amendment because, as shown in the graph, the average number of time between sentencing and execution is more than 15 years. Decades in isolation without access to family, other prisoners, programming, or any other form of intellectual or social simulation, along with the constant knowledge of one's impending but uncertain death, combine to create the death row phenomenon. This isolation is experienced as torture and thereby breaches the Eighth Amendment. The death penalty breaches the 14th Amendment because sentencing a criminal to death runs the risk of eventually killing an innocent individual, and if this is the case, capital punishment specifically offends a citizen's rights under the Due Process Clause. The state must recognize the right to human life, and the death penalty is denying the most basic human right. So therefore, if the government has the right to extinguish human life, they maintain the power to deny access to every other right.
The graph on the left shows the percentage of exonerations and the reasons for them. The graph on the right shows DNA exonerations in the United States. This proves that a large number of people were on death row for incorrect reasons.
Of the 8,776 executions that have occurred from 1890 to 2010, 276, or 3%, were botched. Of the different types of executions, lethal injection has the highest rate of failure. Of the 1,054 executions performed, 75 were failures, which is approximately 7.12%. There's three examples that we have here. On June 24th, 1987, in Texas, Elliot Rod Johnson's execution lasted almost an hour due to collapsed veins. On December 13th, 1988, in Texas, Raymond Landry, the syringe came out and chemicals got everywhere. The execution team had to pull the curtains from the witnesses, and the victim was pronounced dead after 40 minutes of being strapped to the execution gurney. And on September 15th, 2009, in Ohio, Rommel Broom's execution was actually put on hold because executioners spent 2 hours trying to find a vein, which was incredibly painful for Broom. And finally, the Ohio governor called a one week delay so doctors could be counseled for advice. But as of January 1st of this year, he remains on death row. The examples provided are just a few of the people executed for using lethal injection. Execution using electrocution often fails due to minor accidents like a faulty sponge, and sometimes it isn't even due to human error. The electrocution just fails to kill the person, causing unnecessary pain and suffering. Asphyxiation or lethal gas also has similar instability, as the person rarely dies within the allotted time of a few minutes. They often spend almost 6 or 7 minutes in great pain before dying, which is an obvious sign of great trauma.
A tragic and happy example of this is when Damon Thibodeaux served 15 years on death row and in solitary confinement for a crime that he did not commit. He was exonerated thanks to DNA evidence found in 2012. The pressure to plead guilty is a problem. With promises of shorter sentences and avoiding the death penalty, many choose this route and end up being incarcerated for years until exonerated by DNA. The Innocence Act includes 3 aspects that affect the death penalty. These include exonerating the innocent through DNA testing, improving the quality of representation in the state capital cases, and compensation for the wrongfully convicted. Community sentencing or community control refers to placing an offender in some form of highly controlled custody within a community. Conditions are much more restrictive than probation. Treatment programs for mental health, sex offenders, and drug abusers are designed for rehabilitation. Their treatment is paired with probation, inpatient treatments, or community sentencing. A graph shown in the next slide found that a clear majority of voters would choose a punishment other than the death penalty for murder.
According to this graph from Lake Research Partners, 1 in 3 Americans would prefer the criminals who would usually get the death penalty instead get life in prison without the possibility of parole, and the convict must work and provide the victim's family with restitution.